Hello, my name is Stephen Rothstein, and I'm the Managing Director of the Ceres Accelerator for Sustainable Capital Markets. Thank you for joining us today for this live stream event. We have some very special guests that I want to introduce in just a minute. But before that, I want to say a few things. First, that our hearts go out to everybody, each and every one of you and those around the country and around the world that are seriously affected by the global pandemic. We are especially grateful for those that are working on the front lines each and every day to ensure we have a healthy and safe environment. We also want to recognize that the pain being exhibited throughout our society due to the racism that exists and is manifested in so many different ways, including in our financial systems. That we hope today's conversation helps just in a small way move those forward. Before we talk about the specifics, I want to just remind people that today's session is being recorded. You'll all be receiving a copy of the link later on. If you have questions, and we very much welcome them, please put them in the chat box and we'll get to as many of them as we can later in the session. There is a potential for global bandwidth issues. So if that's the case, it'll be beyond our control. The discussion will pause for 30 seconds to allow the bandwidth to readjust. So the schedule for today's program has changed a little bit. Last night, the United States Senate announced 2 votes that are happening literally right now. One including the Great American Outdoors Act, a bill that establishes the National Parks and Public Land Legacy Restoration Fund. That's obviously very, very important. So instead of having Senator Schatz for the whole session today, we're honored that he's able to join us for the first part, give some remarks and a few questions, and then we're also honored that his colleague Micah Morse is with us. We also are thrilled that Betty Yee, Controller of the State of California, are joining. So without further ado, I'm going to ask the Senator to join us for remarks. He is, as I think you all know, the Democratic Senator from Hawaii, that he's on many important committees: banking, housing, urban affairs. He is chair of the Special Council on Climate and so many other key issues. So Senator, thank you for joining us. We'll turn the session over to you, Senator.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to share a few words. And if it were not for the fact that I'm in the middle of voting on the Great American Outdoors Act, I would be really pleased to engage in a longer discussion, although my extraordinary Deputy Legislative Director, who really understands these issues backwards and forwards, will be available to kind of get into the very necessary details about all of this. But I want to congratulate Veena, Stephen, and the whole Ceres team on this important report, which provides a roadmap for managing climate risks. I am not suggesting that regulatory agencies become climate activists. I just want them to do their jobs. And their jobs require that they ensure a stable and efficient financial system. One thing that I repeated to the Federal Reserve and other agencies is that risk is risk, and climate risks are systemic. Not only do they threaten individual financial companies' core business operations, climate risks stand to destabilize our financial markets and the real economy. If these supervisors were ignoring any other system-wide vulnerability, it would be considered a scandal. Their negligence is even more striking because their foreign counterparts are taking coordinated action and developing the tools to assess climate risk. Until recently, US regulators were reluctant to admit that this was a problem worth addressing at all. The Fed and other regulators finally seem to accept that managing climate risk is their responsibility, just like managing any other form of risk. But they have not yet taken the concrete steps necessary. Instead, they are letting systemic risk build. Banks and other financial companies are not only vulnerable to systemic climate risk, they are actually creating the risk. There is good money to be made financing and investing in activities that accelerate climate change, and financial firms believe they can somehow avoid the costs later, probably by pushing the costs onto taxpayers. The COVID-19 pandemic has reminded us that the government is willing to pump out trillions of dollars to shore up even the riskiest corners of our financial system. Financial regulators have the authority and responsibility to curb this recklessness. Some financial companies are making strides on their own. They're making commitments to sustainable investing and announcing decisions to pull out of thermal coal and Arctic drilling. The problem is that these firms are still analyzing climate change as a reputational challenge, acting in response to public opinion. But this is the low-hanging fruit. While ESG is great, climate change needs to move out of the sustainability division and into the risk management division. This is where the regulators come in. They have the authority to establish clear expectations for appropriate climate risk management and to impose requirements to reduce risks throughout the financial sector. For example, bank supervisors in the UK and Netherlands are starting to stress test for climate risk, something that I have legislation to enact here. The European Central Bank is requiring banks to take steps to include climate change in their risk management and business strategies. US regulators can and must do the same. And this must not be siloed as though it is a consumer offering in the ESG category or a reputational effort as if it's part of the marketing for a financial company. This has to be understood in the way that I said earlier. Risk is risk. They must start by developing standards for climate scenario analysis, stress testing, governance, disclosures, and more. Then they need to incorporate those standards into their supervision of banks and other financial companies and assessment of risk across the entire system. With this report, Ceres provides a comprehensive accounting of the steps our regulators should take immediately. Our regulators no longer have an excuse for inaction. They have a roadmap in front of them, and they are falling behind our international counterparts. Congress has given the regulators plenty of tools to reduce systemic risks. They just need to start using them. Thank you very much. Be happy to entertain, I think, a couple of questions before the vote starts in about 5 minutes.
Great. So first, Senator, thank you so much. As I said to your staff, I have some relatives that live in Hawaii that are enormous fans of yours, and I can see from those thoughtful and forceful remarks why they place so much trust in you. Can you talk a little more about your legislation and what's the attitudes of your fellow colleagues in Congress about some of the issues you just raised?
Well, the legislation to require climate stress tests is kind of on the leading edge here. And we have a couple of Democrats that are sort of nibbling on it. But I'm a little cautious to talk about this only in the legislative context for the following reason. I don't think that whether it's the Fed or the Securities and Exchange Commission or the CFTC or any of our regulators, I don't think any of them lack the tools to do what is necessary. And so the climate stress test legislation is a marker, and I would like to enact it in statute. But I think it's important for us not to stipulate that we need new legislation. What we need is for the regulators to take this risk, which is material, seriously, and for them to start to feel comfortable with the idea that they're not taking a position on public policy. They're not even taking a partisan position. They're simply doing what the Quadrennial Defense Review, what the intelligence agencies have jointly confirmed, what everybody who studies this matter has concluded, which is that this risk is real. It is not a future risk. It is a now risk, and it is material, and it needs to be accounted for, especially as it relates to making sure that we have a financial system that works. So I'm obviously always for passing my legislation, but I don't want to concede the idea that we have to enact legislation in order to get what we need done in the United States financial system and among our regulators. They have the tools. They just have to find the courage and to iterate these tools and do what the rest of the world is beginning to do.
First, thank you and that's very powerful, and we completely agree. All of the recommendations that Veena is going to talk about in a few minutes are, as the senator said, able to be implemented without legislation, but legislation clearly would help to focus and motivate them. In your conversations with some of the financial regulators, what is their reaction? What do they think about your perspective, Senator?
So I think we're making progress. That's the first thing to say. A lot of them are, I mean, they sort of think that they're sort of engaging in some act of political courage to say climate change is real and it's material. So we're at least there. I think they want to eschew and avoid a political debate, and that is fair enough. And so we walk them through how this is not political and how this is about accurately accounting for risk, and especially with some of our regulators that need to ensure that investors have all the information that is necessary. So we walk them through that. And then I think I would divide this into sort of three categories. First, it's a psychological sort of political threshold, and we're getting there. Second, they want to understand why they should be on the leading edge of this. And then we walk them through why risk is risk. And then third, I think there's a really legitimate conversation going on with the Bank of England and the Network for the Greening of the Financial System about how exactly to do this, how to just develop a uniform platform, how these stress tests would actually function. And so there are mechanical, like legitimate regulatory issues where it's one thing to say that they want to do it. It's another thing to sort of figure out the platforms on which to do this in an intelligent and fair way. That part's fair. I'm not suggesting that they sort of jump into this in the next 6 weeks. I'm saying that they need to start this process and iterate a platform that works for everybody. Otherwise, you're going to have the rating agencies and the different financial companies and everybody working, some on the basis of sort of reputational risk, others on the basis of physical risk to their properties, other systemic, and then it's just going to be a mess anyway. So I would divide it into those three categories. But once we can get them through the first two thresholds, then there are some really legitimate challenges for these regulators to work through. I think I can take 2 more questions as long as I'm quick in answering.
Okay. How has the pandemic and the reaction to that affected both either regulators or legislators in the thinking of climate change, or has it affected it at all?
I don't really know the answer to that, but I'll just make one quick observation, which is that I think we've learned that the government can do big things in an emergency. That's a lesson for all of us. I'm a little cautious to draw too many parallels between climate and COVID-19. I'm a little cautious to assume that this is a sea change that will impact the way regulators and legislators and the public respond to the need for climate action. But I will just observe that when necessary, the U.S. government can act swiftly and boldly.
Great. One more question if you have time. If not, I understand. Sure. So as part of this, the green recovery, Congress has done a lot already and is going to do more. Do you think Congress will take the steps that some of the other countries, whether it be Canada or Europe, have, whether it be to require disclosure like TCFD or to build more green recovery into the infrastructure plans?
Well, I think you want to, again, divide this into 2 categories. First, our small businesses and lots of individual families and county and state governments are really facing an extinction event. And so to the extent that we're dealing with, the need for unemployment insurance, or the need for direct aid, the need to bail out hospitals, the need to provide PPE, that's a more immediate concern. And I don't necessarily think there's a big green aspect to that. When we think about however, even in the best case scenario, if therapeutics are available this fall, if COVID-19 indeed ends up being more seasonal, if we adopt universal mask wearing and social distancing, even in the most optimistic scenario, we're going to be in a deep financial hole for a couple of years. And then we have to think about what kinds of investments make the most sense for a recovery. I have a hard time believing that any infrastructure plan will lack a sort of a green tint, whether it's transportation, ground transportation, aviation, maritime, the grid, broadband. All of this has to be done just with an eye towards what the future is going to be like. And so I'm a little cautious to call it sort of, a green recovery, because I think that can scare away some people who would otherwise be amenable to the idea that we should upgrade our grid, that we should have transportation systems that work better, that we should do universal broadband, that we should enable clean energy. All of those things are actually areas where we could achieve some bipartisan support. I will also say that for those of you who are handicapping the likelihood of an infrastructure bill passing this year, for what it's worth, and I've gotten lots of things wrong, including the 2016 election. For what it's worth, I do not think we will pass infrastructure legislation this year. I think that is going to wait until we are, sort of on the rebound, but realizing that it's going to be a long road.
Great. Well, thank you, Senator. We know you have to go vote in national parks. That's very important. Thank you for joining, and we'll continue this with our other colleagues. Thank you,
Thanks,
Senator,
everybody.
for all your leadership. Thank you.
Thanks.
So again, let me now do a little more formal introduction of our other distinguished guests. As you've already heard, Micah Morse is a Deputy Legislative Director and Senior Counsel for the Senator, and her policy work focuses on banking, finance, including climate work. We are particularly humbled to have State Controller Betty Yee. Betty is only the 10th woman in California history to be elected to statewide office. As the state's Chief Financial Officer, she serves on the boards of the nation's two largest pension funds, CalPERS and CalSTRS, with a combined portfolio of over $620 billion. Controller Yee is engaged in advancing climate investment policies in many ways. We're also honored that she serves on the Ceres board. And last but by no means least is the brains behind this report is Veena Ramani, who's a Senior Program Director of the Capital Market Systems. She wrote this report as well as many other reports and stuff, so we're honored to have all of you with us today. With that, I'm going to turn over to Tim, if you can go to the next slide. Just in terms of, we're going to spend a few minutes on the accelerator and the report. So the accelerator for sustainable capital markets was started last year, and it's a division within Ceres to focus on the capital markets. We have a number of projects. I won't spend time on those today because of, but this is one of them, and happy to talk to people offline about others. Next slide. That when we think about this, I think really the Senator highlighted this, how that the regulators have today the role and the responsibility to think about climate. So Veena, I'm going to go to the next slide and turn over to Veena, who'll give a summary of the report, which I think you've all received a link to. Veena?
Great, thanks very much, Stephen. So again, the Senator, it's really wonderful to be able to follow the Senator because I think he's provided a great preview to a lot of the points that we make in our report, sort of titled Addressing Climate as a Systemic Risk, a call to action for US financial regulators that was released at the beginning of this month. So this report essentially makes 2 points. First, it makes the point that climate change is a systemic risk, posing a threat to the stability and the competitiveness of US financial markets. And the second point that it makes is that because of this, US financial regulators have a role to play in addressing climate change as a part of their existing mandate. So we cover both federal and some state regulators as a part of this report. We built this report on over sort of 2 decades of work that Ceres has done in working with financial regulators, including the SEC, on climate and other ESG issues. But again, as the Senator mentioned, we both learn from as well as lean heavily on the leadership that we're seeing from the global regulatory community on climate change. Again, we thought that thinking about these issues from a global perspective was important to address what is at the end of the day a global as well as a local issue. Next slide, please. So as I've mentioned before, in the first half of the report, we make the case that climate has the potential to essentially destabilize US financial markets. So to point to this, we point to the fact that we point to the physical impacts that all of us are already experiencing, the extreme weather events that we are seeing, that we're continuing to see in the country, and the financial impacts that these extreme weather events are having. We point to the fact that social and environmental factors have in fact compounded these financial impacts, including things like health impacts, losses in productivity, social upheaval, including the disproportionate impacts that climate change is in fact having on our most vulnerable communities. Next slide, please. We point to the fact that climate isn't a far off issue, that we are seeing the impacts, including the financial impacts, play out right now, including in some of the largest economies within the country, including California and Florida. We reiterate, as many have, that an unplanned transition to a low carbon future would really cripple the economy and have some pretty devastating impacts on key industries. We note that banks and insurance companies who lend to industries that are particularly exposed to climate change are in fact on the front lines of many of these financial risks because of the exposure to climate risks that they hold in their own portfolios. And finally, and I believe most importantly, we note that while each of these separate impacts is significant, none of them exist in isolation. They all impact each other. And it is the way that these impacts interact with each other, or more importantly, what we don't understand about how they in fact interact with each other, that poses some of the gravest risks to financial markets. And which is why we call on US financial regulators to act and act now, especially to start with starting to think about the impacts that climate change has in terms of their own mandates. So as Stephen mentioned before, our report actually lays out over 50 specific action steps that the US financial regulatory community can take to address climate change as a part of their mandate. These recommendations can be categorized into 4 buckets. First, we call on financial regulators to affirm that climate change is a systemic risk and begin the research, again, building on what's already out there to understand the impacts on their own mandates, whether it's financial markets, or securities markets, or commodities markets, or the market. We note that many of the regulators that we've identified supervise key industries, including the financial sector. So we call on them to integrate climate risk as a part of this process, including things like stress testing, as the Senator mentioned, like they do for other financial risks. We call on regulators to mandate climate disclosure. Our rationale here is that you cannot make good decisions on the risks that the Senator mentioned at the business level, at the investor level, or at the regulatory level without good information. So we clearly need to up the ante in terms of the provision of regulators by firms within the US. And finally, we call on regulators to coordinate with one another, as well as their global peers, to develop a shared playbook for action. The Senator mentioned many specific instances, including opportunities with the Network for the Greening of the Financial System, or NGFS. As the Senator noted, as Stephen noted, everything that we've identified in this report falls within the existing mandate of the agencies in question. So we think that legislation could help motivate action, could help accelerate action, could potentially remove any ambiguities in interpretation, but at least according to us, everything builds on the mandate of where the agencies have authority right now. Almost everything that we've recommended in this report is built on templates that we've seen globally or leadership that we're already seeing in parts of the US. And we also note the particular responsibility that US regulators have to act and act now, given they are stewards of what is essentially the largest economy in the world. Next slide, please. So this slide, and I'm not going to go into this in any amount of detail, gives you a quick sense of the range of agencies that we focus on in the report, as well as some of the specific action steps that we are recommending, again, pulling on the broad buckets that we've mentioned before. So Stephen, I'll pass it back to you.
Great, thank you, Veena. And again, you'll be getting, everyone who's on the webinar will be getting these slides later on. And there are already several questions that have come into the chat box, but I want to encourage you to submit more. I'm now honored to really introduce Betty Yee. As I said, she is distinguished in her personal and professional life, and she's one of the most influential voices in this area. So turn it over to you, Betty, and thank you again for everything you do.
Great, thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Veena. And really thrilled that Senator Schatz was able to share some time with us and kick this off, and really grateful for his leadership on this front as well. I just wanted to maybe bring some perspectives, just following on Senator Schatz's comments about really kind of this intersection that we find ourselves. And again, I also want to just extend my heartfelt thoughts to those who are affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, and especially never enough opportunities to thank those who are on the front lines, keeping all of us healthy and safe. So thank you. In California, what I will say is, obviously this pandemic-induced recession has really just brought a lot of issues top of mind for our lawmakers and certainly for our communities up and down the state. We have just record numbers that have applied for unemployment benefits. We have an economic recovery that we believe will take a period period of the next several years. And so, as we think about all these issues, and we're in the middle of trying to enact a balanced budget for our fiscal year beginning July 1st, there are a lot of things that are converging that really have, I think, in your opening comments, Stephen, about why is this getting traction during a time when we have so many other just urgent issues that are top of mind for people. And I think what it is that there is really, this set of really concrete actions in this report, I think, suggests that there can be some movement that hopefully on the other side of this pandemic, and certainly as we approach the other side of this pandemic, as we're dealing with the issues of racial equity, that we have the opportunity to see just how the financial markets can hopefully be stable enough to create new economic opportunities. And so I think it's not necessarily a surprise. And I will say the activism here in California at least suggests to us that whether we're talking about the disparate impacts of COVID-19 or whether we're looking at the growing issues of racial inequity, that all of these issues really are focused on the economy, and which is predicated obviously on the stabilization of our markets. And so I think this is very, very timely and topical. And as my responsibility on the two pension boards continues to be focused on how we keep the funds stabilized during this recessionary time, there's no pause, with respect to looking at the impacts of climate. Just because we have a global public health crisis and because we are dealing with some of these other social economic issues, climate change is not taking a rest. And I think for us to continue to really try to create the momentum to not take an eye away from this, to continue the work that we need to do to be sure that we are just jumping at every opportunity that we can to look at how we just get our arms around this area of risk is really all hands on deck. What I will say is that as we look at this report, what I think is really, really critical is the fact that, and what Veena has said over and over, and Senator Schatz as well, these are all action steps that are within the broad authority of these financial regulators that can be taken now. And when I look at, and some of them have moved, frankly, and probably not fast enough, but the US is lagging behind their global counterparts in terms of taking this type of action and really understanding and embracing this risk and doing everything it can to help to really influence the market. We have, I think the issue whether this is a political question or not, I think is one where the fact that we're seeing such response to this report already since it's been released, the fact that we see bipartisanship where Senators Feinstein and Senator Rubio are really calling on the financial regulators, particularly the CFTC, to start to address the risk of climate change. And I just want to mention the CFTC, one of the first regulators to actually establish a working group on looking at climate risk, and Ceres CEO Minnie Luber are part of that working group. But this is what it's going to take, is really the regulators acknowledging and as the first step, really attesting to the fact that there is risk. And really walking the talk. I mean, I think this is the time of where there's no escaping the risk is real. For me, at the very bottom line of why it matters to me, certainly as the controller, as a trustee on both of our large public pension funds, the 3 million members of our pension funds, rely on benefits in retirement or in disability or with illness, really based on the fact that we can get sound investment returns, and much of that is really predicated on the condition of our financial markets as well. But the other thing I will say about this is, I probably am less circumspect than Senator Schatz with respect to seeing these intersections of COVID and climate, and certainly the civil unrest that we are experiencing. That's not to say that, consciously as lawmakers, as policymakers, that we are linking those up. They ought not be linked up. Each of them have really their own set of priority and urgent need for focus and attention. On the other hand, when I think about the urgency of each of those and how we are going to need to really work collectively, and at the end of the day, how we're going to recover, frankly, from each of these crises, it will require that we look at some of the strategies in tandem that, as certainly in California, when we look at economic recovery, much of what we are looking at is that climate resiliency will be every part of that recovery. And that's at the very activist level, all the way up to our top policymakers, including our governor. And so this is really a time where we need our regulators to step up and not only walk the talk, but also begin to look inwards and to see just what their own risk is. And when we talk about disclosure, it's not about disclosure by others, but really looking at the very regulators themselves in terms of their own footprint and their involvement and impact on either creating the risk or not managing it enough. So I'm just thrilled that with this report, our regulators really have clear guidance now. There's really no excuse about not to act. These steps are concrete. They are specific. Some of them have already been undertaken in a voluntary manner, but I think much of it could be stepped up multifold. And it's really the input from our regulatory agencies are going to provide some of the clearest guidance to certainly companies and others who are active in the market. And so the accelerator initiative that you described, Stephen, that was announced by Ceres last year, is really meant to spur our regulators to address climate change as a systemic risk to the capital markets. And this next step of the campaign, I know Ceres has drafted a letter to the leaders of the major U.S. financial regulatory entities, including the Federal Reserve and the Securities and Exchange Commission. And this is really an urgent call for immediate action on climate change. And I'm proud to say that I've signed on to this letter as the controller of the fifth largest economy in the world. And I hope that all of you who are listening today will consider doing the same. It's really through this outreach that we're going to begin the fruitful dialogue with our regulatory agencies. Some of them are already responding, but this is going to require, really long-term engagement. I suspect that some of them will be moving at different paces from one another, but this is something that is completely and wholly contained within their current mandate. And so I hope that many will recognize that there's no need to pause. That this work can really get underway right now. And so I just want to thank Veena and the team, Stephen, certainly your leadership on this. This is a blueprint for regulatory action that can begin now. And I hope that, as I said, those of us who are joining can sign on to the letter that really begins to add our voice to the fact that this work needs to happen now. And certainly as we're looking at recovery and approaching the other side of this pandemic, as we're looking at developing more economic opportunities that speak to newer and greener sectors of our economy, that our financial regulators are at the ready to be sure that the markets are prepared for creating those opportunities.
Great. Wow. Very, very powerful. Tim, can you take the slides down, please? That is very powerful and a great example of why the state of California is so fortunate to have you in the leadership role and the country is in terms of all the things that you're doing. We'll talk more about that letter later. We have been bombarded with questions because a number of interests. So I'm going to actually scrap some of my questions and jump right to those. So first, Betty, the question is, when you say that regulators should walk the walk, what do you mean by that? And then if all of these recommendations would be put in place, how would it affect pension funds today?
Sure. So, I think the four elements that Veena walked through really are the elements of how to walk the walk. So walk and this walk the talk. And so we, for example, you look at what the SEC has done to date. I think they can do more. I think that when it comes to corporate climate risk disclosure, in line with the TCFD framework, for example, perhaps that can be mandated. And it wasn't that long ago that we thought that that wasn't possible, but I will say that CalPERS itself, the largest public pension fund in the United States, issued our first TCFD consistent reporting framework, first report this week during our board meeting. And so it is possible, the data is out there, and it is a matter of just really trying to pull this together. And actually what it found, and it was really a call to our board, that our portfolio is far from meeting the Paris goal. We're at about 3% Celsius, 3 degrees Celsius now in terms of warming impact in our portfolio. So that kind of disclosure, I think, is now very possible, and so the SEC could be doing more on that. When we look at the Federal Reserve, they're starting to begin to speak a little bit more loudly about the risks resulting from climate change. And when we look at just what they're doing now in terms of injecting liquidity into the markets, during this recession, so many opportunities there in terms of how if we actually have this framework of really understanding how the impacts of climate risk on the markets, that all of the quantitative easing measures that are being taken now actually could be very intentional with respect to being sure that our assets are being directed and towards low carbon.
That's very, very helpful. Micah, maybe you could just, on the point that Betty, you were just talking about in terms of disclosure, in your conversations or the Senator's conversations with regulators, what are you hearing on the general concept of disclosure or the specific concept of TCFD? And then afterwards, Veena, maybe you could help just give a little more of an international context of what Canada's doing or Europe or others. Micah?
Sure. So there are sort of, two levels of disclosure. You have the SEC's 2010 guidance, which says that companies should be disclosing material climate risks. And I think, if you look at different 10K filings, those disclosures are sort of all over the place. We've seen some really in-depth and informative ones, not surprisingly, from companies that are already disclosing under a TCFD framework or the Carbon Disclosure Project. And then others, which sort of make me laugh, which say things like, this company is vulnerable to acts of God. And you kind of think, all right, we've got a long ways to go. I've seen at least one or two examples of this SEC sending comment letters to companies for inadequate climate disclosure under the 2010 guidance, but it's really hard to gauge. I know Ceres has done some analyses of that, and I think what it comes back with is that for a long time now, that guidance has probably not really been enforced in a meaningful way. On the TCFD disclosure, I agree that you're sort of, as more companies are voluntarily disclosing, and that makes it much easier to broach the topic of mandatory disclosures. Interestingly, the most promising conversation we've had about TCFD is with Federal Vice Chair Randall Quarles, who has said in banking committee hearings that he's been a big proponent of TCFD and furthering that work in his role on the Financial Stability Board. And then we have then followed up with questions about, does he see the value of there being consistent and comparable disclosures, which would be a very different framework than leaving it up to companies to decide when something is material. Then, when you talk to the SEC, Chairman Clayton also acknowledges the value of consistent and comparable, but it feels unlikely that in this administration, given the work the SEC has already done, I think, to curtail shareholders' rights to be able to push companies to disclose more, it doesn't seem that they would be that open to such a significant change in what is considered mandatory disclosures. But I think that is where we would want to find ourselves, and somewhat soon, because I think investors want this information. Companies need to be thinking about it. And without that, it makes it incredibly difficult. And I thought something that State Controller Yee said really resonated, which is, if we had this disclosure, if we had this information, then the trillions of dollars that we're spending now in this COVID response could be done in a way that minimizes risk to the economy and to the financial system. And when we've written to the Federal Reserve about this and the standing up of their different facilities, the fact of the matter is there's a limit to what they can do because the information isn't out there.
Great. First, thank you very much, and for that nuance and that information about the conversations with the Fed and the SEC and others. That's very insightful. Veena, maybe you can help give kind of a broader context, international context.
For sure. And again, I really do want to appreciate and reiterate the points that both Micah and Controller Yee made, which is that climate change disclosure is helpful, clearly, not only for companies to make better decisions and investors to make better decisions. Given that our report calls on financial regulators to do the assessment in terms of systemic risk, financial stability impacts, they can't do that without information either. So climate change disclosure is fundamental to all that. Our report calls on climate change disclosures using a few angles. We call for aggressive and robust interpretation of the 2010 guidance. We also call on the SEC to essentially mandate TCFD-based disclosures. We also call on the financial regulators as well as insurance commissioners to try to integrate climate change disclosures and as a part of their supervision of the banking and the insurance sector as well, because I think we need climate change disclosures from companies. We also need it from the finance sector to have a sense of their own exposure to these issues, as well as to have a sense of how they contribute to these issues. So both of those components, I think, are important. So to answer your question finally, Stephen, in terms of the broader context, that we have seen a lot of global regulators actually start to mandate TCFD disclosures. But the latest instance that we've seen, which we thought was interesting, especially given the economic recovery that we're seeing sort of countries around the world starting to get into, came from the government of Canada, where as a part of their own lending to large companies, as a part of their economic recovery package, as a part of that, they have actually mandated that large companies have to disclose using the TCFD guidelines. So again, using some of the lending that's being given to these sectors and having climate change considerations being tied to some of those loans is a trend that we're seeing.
Great, thank you very much. Controller Yi, one of the questions in the chat box is, people were impressed about your description of TCFD report. Can you describe a little more why you decided to do that? And if people wanted to look at it, is that available on your website?
Yes, absolutely. Actually, it's on the CalPERS website, so calpers.ca.gov. And it was really started as a legislative mandate to look at the climate exposure within our portfolio. And because of all of the work and leadership of CalPERS with respect to initiatives like Climate Action 100, certainly the role that some of our key staff have played before some of the regulatory bodies, we felt that we were prepared to really lead the charge in terms of what a TCFD framework consistent report would look like. And obviously borrowing from a lot of different data sources and modeling that get to scope 3 emissions, and that it is possible. And we wanted to actually lead this year with that report because we believe that this is the next step that, frankly, from financial regulators all the way down to companies, is the kind of information that we're going to need. And so, and I think for us, because we, in Climate Action 100 Plus, you'll remember, really started as from CalPERS' own carbon footprinting of our global equities portfolio. And so we recognized the high carbon concentration within that portfolio, began to reach out to other institutional investors globally and found that same concentration. And that's really how Climate Action 100 began. And so now with this type of reporting, we hope that we can actually put it in the space, maybe get it back before Climate Action 100 Plus, look at it within this particular initiative as well, that just to show that this is possible to do. We need not delay. And to Micah's point, I mean, I think it's difficult, I know, when we get information that just looks like all different shapes and sizes, but this is a framework that really was developed to meet this goal of having some modicum of uniformity in terms of what's reported, to look at all sources of emissions, and to begin to start the planning and certainly the scenario analysis that follows off of that is the roadmap, frankly, that I think investors and financial regulators need to insist upon with respect to our companies.
Great. Two other questions in the chat box. One relate to what could investors look at? What would be the template for them to look at to have a Paris-aligned portfolio? One obviously is look at what CalPERS has done. There's a lot of great information there. Ceres has a stream of work going on for individual climate action plans, Paris-aligned portfolios. At the end, many of you are already in touch with us, but contact whomever you talk to, or we'll show Veena and my email. We're happy to talk more about that later. I also wanted to highlight that our report, while we spent a lot of time and a lot of effort in Washington, the report also talks about state regulators, insurance and banking regulators. And just on the issue of disclosure, 2 years ago, a group of 6 insurance regulators regulators came together. They have a climate disclosure process in their states, including the state of California, state of Washington, and others, and they submitted to the insurance companies. They said, we would welcome you to submit this in a TCFD format. Last year, one company did. We hear this year, maybe two or maybe more will. So we also hope that this work grows at the state level in the banking and insurance areas. So all the state work. And again, if any of the colleagues want to add anything, feel free, or I'll jump to the next question. Okay. Micah, we want to figure out how to for this on a bipartisan basis. As we've all talked about, this can be done by the regulators alone, but where do you see the broadest appetite, on what issues do you see the appetite that might cross party lines?
Yeah, so obviously, the letter that Senators Feinstein and Rubio sent recently, I think shed a little bit of light on where those openings are. Republican senators and representatives that represent areas that are going to be particularly hard hit by climate impacts are going to be thinking a lot about resilience and sustainability, and as well as the regional and state impacts of climate change. I mean, if you have people who have to leave a jurisdiction because sea levels have risen, or there's just much more flooding, or homeowners can no longer get affordable insurance for whatever reason, then you're going to see a knock-on effect to municipal and city budgets and the sort of economic performance of those areas. So I think that there's, we're sort of seeing those impacts already, and so those will tend to accelerate. And if you represent those constituencies, then you'll need to start to take that seriously. I think one roadblock that I've run up against is that even insurers who are on the front lines of these issues, when you talk to them about climate risk, they say, yes, we've been thinking about climate risk for decades. This is very central to our business model. And so that is why we are lobbying Congress about resilience. And you think, okay, that is very important. There's certain impacts we're never going to avoid, and we need resilience for sure. But if you ask them, what are you doing to advocate for reducing risks? So not just making yourself less vulnerable to the risks that exist, but actually taking risk out of the system by getting a handle on climate change. They say, well, we have a diverse membership and they all different political perspectives, and so it's very hard for our association to ... But I think, it goes to the fact that this is still considered a somewhat political issue, and the solutions, tend to raise those old partisan divides. So I think, we need to, I have always believed that if you get financial institutions seriously thinking about this and financial regulators asking tough questions, then you start to create a less political space for people to start talking about solutions. So I think that the work that Ceres is doing in this regard is going to be important and helpful for drawing in more voices. And I have heard other Republicans ask questions about stress testing. I've heard climate stress testing specifically. I've heard Republicans ask questions about increase of climate risk in the government-sponsored entities in housing finance. And I've heard them ask questions about this with respect to insurance. So the interest is there. We just need to create a space where we can talk about solutions in a slightly less politicized way.
Great, that's very, very insightful. And I'm thrilled that our report already has received bipartisan support. We obviously want to get more of that, but there are organizations and individuals on both sides of the aisle. Veena, there have been a few questions to talk more about stress testing for banks and scenario analysis. Can you just talk about what the recommendations are in the report a little more in those areas?
Sure. So we do call on the banking supervisors, including the Fed, to essentially conduct stress tests for banks, and as a part of that, define sort of scenarios, methodologies, models. As they say, there's sort of lies, more lies, and statistics. So I think what we want to do is make sure that there is sort of consistency, comparability, and credibility in some of the analysis that we are looking for financial institutions to do as a part of this process. We are also calling on the Fed and other financial regulators to, again, coordinate with the global regulatory constituency. The NGFS, for instance, has actually done some initial thinking, working with other central banks. I think the more that we could encourage our financial regulators not to reinvent the wheel, but to build on the playbook that's already been devised by other regulators, to sort of develop a collective planned approach going forward, that might be the best approach, and also would likely reduce the burden on some of the institutions going forward.
Great. Controller Yee, that earlier this week, BP announced that they were doing a write-down of, I think the number was 17 billion of their oil reserves. What does that say to you about, as somebody who's managing lots of money, when you see news like that, how do you interpret that? And what does that say for the future? And happy to have others jump in as well.
Well, I think when I read something like that, it really, in my mind, says there's a role for the financial regulators here. Yeah, we've been seeing obviously what's been happening to oil and oil prices over the last period of months, and and I think one of the things that we should be mindful of, and a role in terms of these regulators in protecting the market, is really the value of capital. And so, what is the true value of capital? As we look at these transitions that are happening in the market, and so. I think this is really topical in terms of the role that we want these regulators to do, and in stepping up and being sure that when they are looking at certainly protecting the market, when they're providing that oversight and supervision, that how capital is valued is just so front and center to that responsibility. And so and we're going to see a lot of that, and won't just be BP. And so I think this is really the time to ask the regulators to please step up, and particularly in many of the carbon intensive industries where we know that will have reverberations throughout the rest of the market.
Thank you. That's very, very helpful. Micah, we've seen a lot of coordination between the FDIC, the Office of the Controller of the Currency, and the Fed in the current situation, the COVID situation. How much have you seen that overall? And is there any conversation among all of them that you're aware about on climate issues as they look at disclosure, stress tests, scenario analysis?
So I think it depends on the issue, because I think we've seen with the COVID response, they've been working hand in glove with each other. That coordination is great. I think on Community Reinvestment Act, that's not been the case. There's some kind of really troubling schisms between the regulators on how they want to handle modernizing that landmark law and regulations. On climate change and associated risks, I think we've been a bit disappointed to see that the OCC and the FDIC have been less open to talking about this with us. The Fed has by far been the most open and the most willing to engage with us. And I'm not really sure why that's the case. I think they have, so the Fed has two roles. They have their monetary policy role, and then they have their supervisory roles. They've engaged with us on this on both sides of that. And you'd think that on the supervision piece of it, that those arguments would hold true for the OCC and the FDIC as well. And I'm not sure if maybe they don't have as many researchers that are digging into the data on this. If they take more of their cues from the Fed's work and supervision, and it sort of trickles down from there. If, just perhaps the perspectives of the individuals that are in leadership there don't consider that to be a top priority, we're not really sure. I think our strategy, and your report goes a long way to helping us with that, is to just get more concrete and drill down and be more specific about what we think we should see and what we're asking them to do, and why that aligns with their statutory authorities and responsibilities. And the more we can do that, I think the easier it is to point to something and say, your supervisory manual should have a reference to this. Every supervisor that goes in looking at loans backed by oil reserves should be asking questions about transition risk, because as you just referenced with the BP write-down, that affects loans that were backed by those assets. If you're considering a company that might be vulnerable to hurricanes and severe storms, what models are they using to predict future risk? Are they only looking at historical data sets, or have they somehow built in an expectation that, as NOAA has documented well, the frequency and severity of storms is only getting worse year after year? So I think these are very straightforward questions, and I hope that we can make more progress with them in the future.
That's great. Let me ask, that's very, very helpful in terms of implementation. It relates to actually two other questions in the chat box about what would be the next steps. What would be the next steps to implementation? So Veena, let me ask you, and Betty, you, if you want to jump in as well. If a regulator said, I've read the report, I want to do everything that says here tomorrow, what do we think the next steps in addition to some of the things that Micah just outlined?
I think as a first step, I think what we would love all regulators to do almost immediately is affirm, right? Affirm that climate is a systemic risk. And once this affirmation gets out there, where climate is a systemic risk, it automatically becomes a part of the mandate of many of these agencies who are responsible for maintaining financial stability, for maintaining competitiveness, and for maintaining some of the resilience that, Micah, you talked about as well. So again, as soon as they affirm that climate is a systemic risk, starting to do that research almost immediately, right? I think I'm also cognizant for the fact that our time for action on this issue is extremely limited. That window is starting to close. So affirming that climate is a systemic risk and beginning that research to understand how it fits within their mandates, I think is a step that we're looking to see right now.
Yeah.
Great. Controller Yi, do you want to add anything?
Sure. So definitely the first step is to affirm, but really the second step is to know that this work is already underway in other parts of the world. So I would encourage our regulators to really reach out across the globe to their counterparts. And I think the coordination piece need not be the last step of this effort, but really at the beginning, and understanding that with much of this work underway, that this could actually be helpful in terms of accelerating the work of our own regulators here in the United States.
That's great. Well, first, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I want to first thank each and every one of you. There's literally hundreds of people listening, and thank all of you in your busy schedules, and hope everyone who's listening today and their families are safe during these times. Second is, as Controller Yi mentioned, that she signed on, and we hope that all of you consider signing on. You'll get this information later. We'd love to have as broad a set of voices on this as possible. And then Tim, if you can go to the last slide, again, you'll get this with our contact. If you have other questions, you can let Veena or I know. But I want to end by thanking Micah, Veena, and Betty. They're obviously the senator as well, but the three of you are so articulate. My only challenge is we could have run this for 2 hours, not one. But thank you for shedding a lot of light and for your leadership in Sacramento, in Boston, and in Washington, D.C. Our country is better off because of the three of you. Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining, and hope everyone has a great day. There are also, you'll be getting in the follow-up email, there's other webinars that Ceres is doing, and we'd love to have you join those as well. Thank you again, and stay safe, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.